Hello and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism, the show that finds anarchism, mutual aid, cooperation, non-domination in your everyday life. I am your host, Graham Culbertson. This episode is finally about bread. Bread, the great symbol of anarchism, and specifically it's about Bittman bread, which is a new cookbook that I could not recommend more highly, by Mark Bittman, a legendary cookbook writer, and Kerri, who has been working with Mark on his cookbooks for decades, but I believe this is the first time she's had her name on the front cover. You can also get wonderful updates about food and culture from Mark, Kerri, and others if you sign up for their newsletter, The Bittman Project. I certainly recommend it. So, why are they here? Well, they're here to talk about bread, Bittman bread, but mostly, as you're going to hear, our conversation is not about bread, it's about anarchism. And I want to talk a little bit before you hear our conversation about anarchism as to why it's so important to think about bread from an anarchist perspective. Food is frankly political. I mean, everything is political in some sense, but the way our food is produced is absolutely crucial to how our society runs. What we eat tells you who we are exploiting and who we are supporting. The greatest political symbol in Europe since Rome has been bread. One of the ways that you prevent revolution is giving people bread. And so the first thing that you need to do if you have a revolution is make sure that people have enough bread. But the bread we are eating right now, the standard factory white bread, is simply not acceptable. It is not ethically acceptable given the exploitation of the land and the workers who produce it. And it is just not healthy. It is not good for you. You may have heard that you shouldn't feed bread to ducks because it's not good for them. White bread, this is true, but it's not any better for you than it is for them. You shouldn't feed white bread to yourself. So obviously you've heard that you should eat whole wheat bread, maybe especially sourdough whole wheat bread, because sourdough, it doesn't mean it's sour. Mark complains about that word in his text, and I agree. Sourdough means it's a natural yeast culture. It's like making bread from the bread version of yogurt instead of buying your yogurt in the store. Now, the narrative, and I think this narrative is mostly true, is that as healthy and hearty as whole grain, whole wheat sourdough bread can be, it's just not as good. It just doesn't have the magic components that a modern white bread has. So yeah, sure, the stuff in the bag at the store might be disgusting, but if you get a good baguette or white boule or focaccia at the local bakery, that's just going to be better than the whole wheat loaf sitting next to it. And Bittman bread, and this is my last plug for Bittman bread before we get to the interview. Bittman bread, you can make whole wheat sourdough bread that has way more flavor and umami and just richness than even the best white bread, and yet is incredibly similar in terms of texture and lift and heft. That's why Bittman bread is, for me, a revolution. And it's clearly a return, since it is both whole grain and sourdough, to the kind of bread that our ancestors were eating. And yet, it has characteristics of the bread that was invented in the 19th century, which has come to symbolize decadence. You can have your decadence and your sustainability all at the same time with Bittman bread. I certainly recommend the book. I'll have a link in the show notes. For now, after the music, here's my conversation with Mark and Kerri. Hello, Mark and Kerri. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. We are here today to talk about anarchism and to talk about bread. I don't know, would you guys like to introduce yourselves, or do you want to just jump right into it? I can tell the listeners who you are later.
Yeah, you do it later.
Okay. Very good, very good. So I don't know if you know this. I mean, I don't know to what extent people know this these days, but the great icon of anarchism is not the red and black flag, it is bread. And the most famous work of anarchism is The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. And there's a whole group of left-wing YouTubers now. They're not necessarily anarchists, but they're all left-wing. They don't do advertisements, and it is called BreadTube as opposed to YouTube, because bread is the icon of anarchism. But in my experience, most anarchists don't actually talk about bread. It's a metaphor. But Kropotkin, he actually cared a lot about bread. And so when I read your book, Bittman Bread, the book that you two put together, it is about our daily bread. And Kropotkin says that is the point of the revolution. The revolution is that everyone shall have their daily bread. So since I'm eating your bread daily, I thought we would talk about that.
Wow.
I think I knew that at one point because I have a little bit of an anarchist past. But I wish I had known it when Kerri and I were writing the introduction to the book, because it's so cool. And I'm gonna go look at Conquest of Bread when we're done, because that's just that's so cool.
It makes a lot of sense though, because bakers, the professional bakers at least, they're all about providing, and they're in the middle of the night, the cycle is, and it's kind of like you take yourself out of society to bake your bread and stuff, and I like it. I'm going to read that book too.
And the society nevertheless depends on you. And, the other watchword from Kropotkin is mutual aid. And one of the things he talks about in that book is that bread is mutual aid. What do you need to have bread? Well, you need to have that dedicated baker, of course, but you need to have farmers, and you need to have the whole community comes together to bake bread. And the anarchist message is you don't have to have corporations forcing people to do that. People don't have to get paid to do this. This is what the community will do if left alone. If you leave a group of people alone, you know what they do? They grow wheat and they make bread. Or in other parts of the world, rice or corn or whatever. But Kropotkin is, from Russia. So the bread is the image of sustenance and the community.
Oh, I love this.
Another interesting thing is that you think of anarchism, or I think of anarchism, as sort of improvisational, and so is real bread making. We have a recipe, obviously. We have many recipes, but we think of cooking as, I don't know if jazz is the right word or anarchism is the right word, but a skill that you develop and then do at your own pace and in the way you want to, and so on. Certainly that's true of bread baking for those of us who are not professionals. And there is this, well, I'm going to have to read that Kropotkin. I do remember who he is anyway. An old Russian dude, so what? But yeah.
Well, what I found really interesting in the work, Mark and I worked together for almost 2 decades now on many, many books. And what's been interesting about the bread book, and I don't know if it's just because of social media or because it's bread, but there's a community that we've engaged, around baking this bread. And as Mark says, it's very improvisational. We went through a lot of trouble, as you know, in the book, to capture photographs and tell people exactly what the hell to do, exactly when to do it, what it's going to look like. And yet in our community, people will tell me, well, I started following and then I did this, and and I didn't have that, and I didn't read chapter 2 yet, so I did this. And it's like it's been very, very communal. It's been so communal, so much more than, say, a meatball recipe that we posted, where it's like, I don't know, people don't talk about meatballs like they do bread.
Yeah, well, for one thing, bread is life. I'm a real believer in that bread is life, and I like meatballs, but meatballs are not life. But I will just also say, yeah, Kerri, and what I appreciated so much about your recipes, or my absolute favorite part of the recipe, is the way. For those of you who haven't read the book, first of all, get the book. It'll change your life if you're willing to put the time into making the bread. It has changed my life in just a couple of months. You don't get the ratio of flour and water from the recipe. You get the ratio of flour and water from the experience of making the bread. You've got a certain amount of water with the flour, and then you put water on your hands and you make the bread, and it is magical. And you can tell, I mean, Mark and Kerri tell you how to do it in the book, but as you're learning how to do it, the bread, it's this natural process, this mutualism, to use another anarchist term, between what you are doing and with the water and the flour, and it just works. It doesn't need a recipe, and it can't have a recipe, because how much water in the air of your kitchen and the warmth of your kitchen. I can't wait to see. I mean, I live in North Carolina. This bread is going to be unlike anything I have made in December when I'm making it in July. But I'm not scared of that because the recipe builds into it this magical, yes, jazz, anarchism, any of these metaphors for it. It works if you follow the process, and you learn and adapt, and the yeast adapts to the temperature, and it works. And that's different from any other baking I've ever done in my life.
Oh, thank you.
I'm trying to sort of build on or follow this metaphor. I mean, obviously, I do believe that there should be a stated human right to food, to good food, and obviously bread in many cultures, bread is the underpinning of diet, or was. I'm trying to see that as specifically bread and a specifically anarchist argument, and maybe I'm not quite seeing that.
Well, in Animal Vegetable Junk, Mark's other book he wrote before this, you did the big, it's anti-corporation, at least. It might
Absolutely.
not be anti-government, but, not having white bread and going back to whole grain, it is a rejection of the corporate structure, isn't it?
Well, rejecting the corporate structure is easy. Arguing that there should be a world without a state. I mean, if you're someone who, I mean, I don't really like labels at this point, but I would argue that the job of the state is to protect people from the corporate structure and to make sure that people have adequate.
Yes. Okay. So
then if there's no role for the state, I mean, I know the state is supposed to wither away and all that, but first we have to get to the point where the state does some good, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So wow. So we're actually going to do. I have a series called Anarchism 101. So based on Mark's response to this, I'm gonna actually do the like Anarchism 101 thing. So
great.
Here's the argument. Goes something like this. First of all, once you create the state and you want it to do some good, it immediately gets captured by elites. And most of the time, these elites are bad elites. They are plutocrats. They are corporations. Sometimes they're good. They're good elites. They're nice people. Perhaps most famously, Barack Obama, a good man who nevertheless, in many other ways, was captured by the logic of the state, didn't really change any of the various George W. Bush terror policies, and was unable to deliver health care. I mean, his signature accomplishment was Obamacare, which made things better, but did not, and was also unable to deliver a great stimulus, in part because of Republicans, but also in part because he got into a room with some really smart experts, and Larry Summers and whoever said, you know what, Barry, we just can't make it so that everyone can have food in this country. We just can't do it. And so anarchism says, first of all, no, those people, you can't let them have power anymore, because even if they are well-meaning, they don't get it. And the other thing anarchism says is the community can do this itself. It's never allowed to because of either the state or the corporation, or it can do it itself. And I'm going to read you a quote from an anarchist writer. There's good reason bakers have been essential to villages, neighborhoods, and households throughout history. We hope this book helps you be that person for the people in your life. So that's from the introduction to your book. And that is an expression of the anarchism that you do not need the state to have food. You need a baker, and you need people to support and love that baker, and you need that baker to support and love other people, and you don't need money to do it. We need money now, sort of, because we're trapped in this money system. But we can imagine a world without money, but we can't imagine a world without community bakeries. And I'm sorry, I'm going to step out and let you guys talk again in a second. The world you get when you don't have community bakeries is you get fake bread. You get white bread that has been made in a factory, and it may keep you alive, but it will not sustain you. And the government will happily pack that shit up and send it to your house if you are hungry. And the anarchists say there must be something better than that.
Yeah, I don't want to be in a position of arguing with you. I just think things are at a place, if we want to define anarchism as direct democracy or something like that, I think it's an easier sell. I think we need to be at a place where, like right now, the less powerful government is, the worse things are. That's my opinion. I mean, powerful in the sense of motivated to do social good. The less it is motivated to do social good, the worse things are. Certainly, it's all powerful. It can't get much more powerful than it is now, but the power is being exercised in absolutely the wrong directions most often. So that thing I said about the role of the state, the correct role of the state, if you will, is to protect people from corporations. I think I really believe that. I don't know how we get to a place where corporations don't do their nefarious, rapacious thing without some bigger entity to rein them in. And I don't know how the people, air quotes, rein them in without the aid of some representative government that is empowered. Now, I know that's not working. I totally agree. And everything you said about Barack Obama is, that is what happened, basically. I mean, we don't really know how well-intentioned he was in the first place, but even giving him every benefit of the doubt.
He was more well-intentioned than some other ones we've had.
For sure.
Yeah, but I think it was a mistake to think he was going to be an anarchist, veer toward yes. Or socialism even. I don't feel, we hoped maybe we would veer more that way, but I never really expected, I don't know, because I believe we have to take money, like Mark, I believe we just have to take money out of the equation. That's the biggest source of power in the government is not the representation, it's the influence, isn't it?
What do you mean, Kerri?
The campaign financing, and that's what gives different people who are supposed to represent us power. Is not it's not coming from them and their ability to represent us. It's coming from their outside influences and the corporations and private donors, and that's who they're beholden to, in my opinion. I think we just have to take money out of the, we might not have to, be careful what you wish for, but I feel like until we stop campaign finance, and stop and just fund elections through the government, I don't think there's going to be enough power in our representation.
This is fascinating. I wasn't expecting this, which is to say, not that we're disagreeing, and I certainly don't think we're arguing, but we are so resolutely on my turf right now in terms of political philosophy. I literally wrote my dissertation on the political process and progress in urbanization and modernity in America in the late 19th and early 20th century, and yet. Exactly what you two are saying is precisely the kind of thinking that I tried to abandon when I started this podcast. So if the question is how do we fix the government, precisely as both of you have said, the government is the obvious tool to use to fight corporations and give people back their lives. And it's hard to think of many instances in the entire history of the world where the government has done that, and even fewer instances where the government has done that and has been sustained. And you can talk to the historians 50 years from now. In America, Social Security and Medicare are big examples of this. But as you know, there's always people who want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare. So if that's what we're hanging our hat on. Go ahead, Mark. Sorry.
I mean, there's also always people who want to strengthen them. I mean, here's a couple other things I believe. And we said yes to coming on the podcast. And we say no to plenty of podcasts. We said yes because we thought this might be a fun conversation. So
you're saying it's not, Mark?
It's not that surprising that it's a fun conversation. Whether you believe that the arc of history is toward progress or not, and it's a big question, right? The world is certainly a different place than it was any number of years. Choose your number. It's a different place than it was then. 5 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, whatever you want. And it's going to keep changing. We know that. And we don't know, I'm going to quote two people. One is, and they're not direct quotes. One's Neil Stephenson, the science fiction, sort of science fiction writer. He said, we all know there's not going to be capitalism in 1,000 years, so why don't we just start figuring out the alternative now? Well, I think we're doing that, but again, the arc of history isn't guaranteed. We don't know what change is going to look like. We just know that there's going to be change, and our job as responsible members of society, as humans, is to try to be agents of positive change. Everybody thinks that. Even people that we think of as bad people think that. And then the other person I'm going to quote is a friend of mine who died last week, whose name is Todd Gitlin, who was president of SDS in 1963, which was way before my time. But he wasn't that much older than me. And he was friends with friends of mine and became a friend of mine. And he was really a wise guy. And what he said was, I'm paraphrasing, while the Republicans were busy taking over municipal and state governments, Democrats were busy taking over the English department. And that was pretty
my PhD's from the English department, and I completely agree with this quote.
I mean, he was an academic, so that's what he would say. But I think the point is, we know that whether you call your ultimate goal anarchism or socialism or progressive democracy or whatever you want to call it, we're really far from any of those things. And what I think anyone who agrees that that's the direction we want society to go in must see that organizing and door knocking and talking about politics and trying to get more adequate or more progressive representation in those state, federal, local governments is what has to happen right now. And if you have an argument that says, no, that's not what has to happen right now, I'd really like to hear it, because I don't think the organizing to get progressive politicians in office is going very well. So if there's a shortcut, I want to know about it. I mean, the other thing is, I'm going to die. We're all going to die. We're not going to see the end of, there is no end, but we're not going to see the end of this process. So our job, as I said, in my opinion, our job is to be agents of positive change. What should that mean to each of us right now is really the biggest question facing people who want to see a better world, a better society.
Yeah.
first of all, before I'm now put in the position of telling Mark Bittman how to solve
I
the
mean, I'm
problems.
a cookbook writer.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, let's have Kerri talk first before I.
No, I agree with everything. I agree with both perspectives. I totally agree with what Mark said. I mean, that's part of why I moved to the Pacific Northwest from Kansas, was to be. I mean, I did a lot of politics in Kansas. My most active period of my life. I was on a progressive caucus in the Kansas Democratic Party for 4 years, and it was, I love the people I worked with, but we were impotent. Really, had no ability to even make pathways in our own organization, because we just faltered, and I do believe that, and I thought that was a community, and I believe that communities are ultimately powerful, but they get hijacked by like influence, and I don't want to say bad people, but people with influence and protecting their self-interest. It's human nature, and I'm not sure how we get over that unless we come together and do something in common ground, but we can't even really, we're fighting a pandemic. We can't even come together to do that. So maybe it's, maybe it is bread, maybe we can,
that's why you're here. Cause it is bread.
That's
the only thing I know. I don't know much about politics. So, I do know that when
we've thought about it enough, and we've talked about it enough, and you do. I mean, there's no reason for us to be falsely modest about what we know or have thought about or talked about politics. So
here's the argument that I make, and I will admit that I'm not getting a lot of buy-in for this argument, except from the people who are already identifying as anarchists. But it goes something like this. It does go back to community. That's why it does go back to bread. I mean, bread is the easiest metaphor for it because of the work Kropotkin did with bread, and it's already, the vocabulary's there. But also because of the communal nature of the bread making process, the bread baking process, the farm, the role of the village. The argument goes something like this, and this is something that James Bowles and I talked about in a recent episode. There are communities in America that work great. I would say, Mark, we're nowhere near as far away from the utopia that we are looking for. If you look at local communities, so many of them are working, and then you say, so many of them are working, and then you say, wait a second, this community has stopped working. It has become a nightmare. We are divided from one another. We're worried there's going to be a civil war. Half the people are triple masking and the other half of people are unvaccinated. What's going on? My answer is, what's going on is we created this thing, this hierarchical top-down system that originates in Washington, D.C., and the goal is to take power, to bring about the world that you want. But in fact, the world that you want is already there in your neighborhood, unless that neighborhood or community has been destroyed by corporations, as they so frequently are. And these institutions, these communities thrive if you can keep red and blue, Republican and Democrat out of the conversation, if you can remind people that within the community, they are together. Whereas in this bigger community that is called the United States of America, they hate one another. And the only reason why the Republicans took over all of those municipal boards, they didn't give a shit about state government. They didn't give a shit about local government. They cared about power and making the country, the United States of America, look the way they wanted it to look. And all the money came from top-down corporations. It's actually a reverse grassroots. They took over, the right wing took over the grassroots in order to take power over the national landscape. And the answer is not going to be, fair enough, do the same thing from the left, but you're right, Mark, it's not working. So what we have to do is take over the grassroots. But we can't take over the grassroots by saying, if we take power, we can do what the Republicans did and have 6 justices on the Supreme Court. We have to take over the grassroots and say, if we take power, we can feed and clothe and educate our community. And the local bakery, especially if it's some sort of co-op and connected to the farmer's market, becomes this image that is what it's all about. And what's happening in DC is preventing actually the communities from working at the grassroots. That doesn't mean I'm not going to vote for whoever the Democratic candidate is for president, but I do not believe that's where we're really going to make the difference. That was okay. There it was.
I mean, I think the co-op argument is strong. You probably know Gara Alperovitz. And if you don't, you should.
Yeah, okay.
He's a big advocate of. I mean, I just get stuck because there are so many regulations preventing good things from happening that somehow I think, well, in order for good things to happen, I mean, we're not arguing, obviously.
No, I don't think we are.
Yeah, I mean, we're not disagreeing even, but I think somehow power needs to be exercised, positive power needs to be exercised on a local level. But you can build all the co-ops you want to build, but if land is still being held by, 90% or whatever it is of all the land in the country is being held by 2% of the population or whatever it is, and 98% of farming is big farming, and by the way, 98% of farmers are white. How you change that is, I don't know how you change that other than making law more fair. And those kinds of laws do happen on a big scale. And yeah, I think we're both talking about community organizing, and I think we agree on that. My belief, and again, I don't intend to live to see this. I don't know what I'm going to live to see, but I think we have to be looking at 50-year plans at this point. I don't think there's a 5-year window in which things are suddenly going to get better, but maybe they can start moving in the right direction. But
okay, let's argue then, because I don't want a 50-year plan, Mark, and I don't want a 5-year plan. I want people to know what they can do tomorrow.
Right, but what they can't do tomorrow is change, for example, the farming structure of the United States. And that is a long-term necessity. If you want to stop climate change, if you want to feed people right, if you want to stop environmental devastation, blah, 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 you have to change the way farming is done in the United States. And now I guess what you're going to say is right. That means we have to change the way farming is done in the United States. But I just don't know that I see. I don't know that that also means seizing power. I mean, doing that on a local level is in some ways the same thing as saying seizing power. So I just don't see it in the short term.
But what we're all talking about in common is that, I mean, nothing's going to happen until we flatten this hierarchy I was talking about earlier, where like, who owns the land and who has the influence, and how do you flatten that, without, some kind of catastrophe? How do you get, even if you have a grassroots community, 100 people, there's going to be 2 people in that group of 100 that are like assholes, and they're going to ruin it for everybody else, unless you like execute them. So, I mean,
so what we are doing again, this is delightful for me because I've had this conversation 1,000 times. I've never had it on the podcast. So this is going to be the first time my
I thought that's what this podcast was about.
No, everyone else who comes on the podcast is like, yes, anarchism is great. I didn't think I was an anarchist, but now I am. So
Wait, the podcast is you lecture people and convince them to become anarchists?
No, the podcast is I give people a definition of anarchism that they say, well, if that's what anarchism is, I'm already an anarchist. And so now
that's kind of what I just said, but okay.
Oh, brutal. So, I mean, what Kerri has described is completely right. Like if you have these 100 people, 2 of them are going to be assholes and they're going to try and take over the commune. And Kropotkin says that's precisely why we need anarchism. What's more dangerous? 2 assholes in a group of 100 that is trying to be anarchist and those 2 people try and take over? Or 2 assholes in a group that is organized with democratic elections and has a chair and a vice chair, and those 2 people wheel and deal until they get elected chair and vice chair, and now they're officially assholes in charge instead of just trying unofficially to be assholes in charge. David Graeber famously describes this argument with someone in Occupy Wall Street who is actually a veteran of the civil rights movement. And the man he was arguing with said, what you're asking us to do is to be governed by a shadow committee. I want to know who the boss is so I can disagree with him or vote him out. And Graeber's argument is you're always being governed by a shadow committee. You never know where the boss is. There could always be someone whispering in the president's ear. We call this the Dick Cheney problem. But then you've also given the person who is the figurehead president all sorts of dangerous powers, and it's better to go it without that structure. And the way you do it is by community organizing, absolutely, but something that is in some way resembles something that's apolitical despite being political, which I would say, making whole wheat bread in your home, especially if you get the flour from a local farmer, which I do. I mean, that's the answer to my question. We need to change farming. Well, I've got a buddy who has a farm and does heirloom grains, and I buy the heirloom grains for him. And as long as enough people are listening and doing that, that will change everything. They can pass a law that says you're not allowed to buy heirloom grains from your friend, but that seems like a law that's not going to get enforced to me.
Right.
I mean, they did have such laws in the USSR, and people were killed for illegal grain. But this is another argument why the left wing shouldn't create structures of hierarchy and power, because then you start murdering farmers for farming. That seems bad. In the right wing, you just pay farmers for not farming, which I would say is also bad.
Well, actually, you get the government to pay farmers to grow things that are bad for the land and bad for people. But yeah.
Yeah, but some farmers are paid for not farming. But yes, again, Mark, we're not going to disagree on the big picture. You could solve most of this problem if you could just write a farm bill that encouraged small farms growing healthy things. But I've given up on the good. I mean, I remember when we thought there was going to be a good farm bill. When was that? It was 2010 or something. There was this progressive farm bill, and it did not happen.
No. Well, you were naive to think that might have happened. Forgive me. Now you're not naive anymore. But the question is,
I was a child, Mark.
Right.
I was born in 1983. Obama was the first president, in my lifetime, in my adult life, besides George W. Bush. So I thought the new era had come, and things were good now. Yeah.
So now you were naive, and that's fine. I guess the difference between us, do I think there needs to be a good farm bill? I mean, I have no hope for a good farm bill, believe me. I have no more hope for a good farm bill than you do. And when people want to talk to me about the farm bill, I say, farm bill's actually irrelevant.
Yes.
Unless maybe you can put some good stuff in there or get some bad stuff taken out, which is great. But if you think you're going to have a good farm bill, and there's a problem with attacking the farm bill, which is that the farm bill is responsible for feeding a lot of people because SNAP is in the farm bill. Yep. So there's this sort of weird devil's bargain where the left, or the so-called left in Washington, doesn't really go after the Farm Bill because it doesn't want, the Republicans say, if you want to go after the Farm Bill, we'll go after the Farm Bill, but food stamps cost whatever it is, $600 billion a year or something. And we'd like that to be half that. So, so it's a little bit scary, but I mean, it's an interesting conversation and one that has to go on, but I have to leave soon. So, and it is your podcast. So I was going to say, let me ask you one more question, but maybe you want to ask me or us one more question.
No, I mean, I'll tell the listeners they should make Bittman bread. You ask me a question. This is fine. Make Bittman bread. Buy the book.
Well, what you're saying, what people should do right now is act locally, build local economies.
Yes.
Be nice to their neighbors, buy things from one another, try to form co-ops, whether they're food co-ops or whatever, and ignore the state as best they can.
Yes, while still, not voting for Republicans.
Right, and taking advantage of the state to the extent that could do any of us any good.
Yes.
Like drive on roads and whatever.
Yes. I mean, there's a huge controversy right now in Chapel Hill because Chapel Hill is trying to take ownership of our main road, which is currently run by the state government. This is what the government is doing now in Chapel Hill, Mark, is arguing about which bureaucratic body is in charge of the roads. And that seems to me like not the kind of thing that we need to be spending our time on.
It matters in New England when you're on a county road and it's a shitty county and the road doesn't get plowed. And then you move on to a state road and the state, in theory, does its work and the road does get plowed. And I mean, I see this stuff. I spend a lot of time in Massachusetts. I see this stuff in Massachusetts all the time. For some reason, it doesn't seem to happen as much in New York State. And I don't know why it is, but that town to town difference is kind of funny. And you do see it on roads. It's where we see it, right? I guess if we knew education systems, we'd probably see it in school systems too. Oh. It's much easier to know more than one road than to know more than one school system.
Well, I guess if we're going to wrap up, I'd like to try to bring it back to the bread. And if we have our 100-person community model again with the two assholes, what job would you give them baking the bread? Would you want, I mean, because the way you're going to convert, I was making a bad joke when I said we'd have to execute them. I would want to convert them, to the community and to the common good, to the mutual aid. And so that you'd want them in the bread making process. What would you do? Would you put them by the oven, so they wouldn't be dealing with the dough? Like, would you distribution? Like, that's the thing that always, like when you have a group, you have to delegate. People have to do, everybody can't do everything or nothing will get done. So, I think that's where the hierarchy becomes, visible, as that, oh, I get to make the bread. I have to be by the oven the whole time. I get to distribute it to the people, like where would you put the two assholes?
This is going to be an insufficient answer, I think, but the answer is you tell them that they don't need to be a part of the bread making process and you give them bread at the end anyway. And you will have two non-assholes who will join the community in relatively short order, or they will walk to another village and that village has two assholes and they got to figure it out.
Maybe they're not assholes in the other village.
Exactly. And maybe not assholes after they have been treated to a non-hierarchical communal experience that they benefit from. I mean, it's hard to imagine this.
No, I like that answer.
Oh, okay. Well, that's my.
It's better than making them plow the roads or whatever. That'll just piss them off.
Like Mal over there.
No. No.
Look, I know you're about to have to go, but I think you said you had one more question, or did we cover it?
No, I think we covered it, but yeah. I will tell you this. When I was a senior in college, I was like a terrible student. And also I'm literally twice as old as you are. So it was all I'm saying is that it was a long time ago. But part of this was how I started writing, so it's interesting. But part of it was I'm just giving myself some cred, I suppose. But I got together with two friends, Madeline and David, and we had all been radicalized in our junior year, which was 1969, 1970, when
That's a year to get radicalized in.
many people got radicalized, right? And well, it's going to become too long a story. So the short version is our senior thesis, which they researched and I wrote. That was the deal. I was like, you guys do all the reading and take all the notes and stuff, and I'll write us an awesome paper. And that was how I became a writer, or it was one of the first things I wrote that sort of mattered. But I just found this thing the other day, and it basically is, I wish I could remember what it's called. It basically is I'll text you or email you the title page, but it's basically an anarchist critique of the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
It's about the failure of the Russian Revolution and its transition from being a people's movement to a miserable hierarchy, which we're certainly in agreement there. But we would all have argued when I was back in the day when I was a real leftist. All the arguments were about how it was ridiculous to critique the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was never anything that it said it was going to be. So it's like critiquing Canada. As it's like Canada is not a socialist country. Well, yeah, we know that. I do have to run. I'm sorry. It's been really fun.
Thanks.
I hope so. It was really fun for me. Okay, well, I will be in touch, and maybe someday we can talk bread a little bit more. But this was I wouldn't, this was
bread's easy.
It's not that easy. It's not that easy, I don't think. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kerri.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks for reaching out.
Thanks, Graham.
Thank
Stay
you
in
for
touch.
the book. Absolutely. All right.
Oh, thank
Okay.
you. Bye.
Bye.
Kerri, we can chat a little bit more if you want to. We can talk science fiction, or you can just go. It's totally up to you. I've got 20 minutes.
You should talk dystopia.
I think we
talk
should,
dystopia.
and we can talk Kansas too. My wife is from Wichita.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll stay on.
Bye,
Okay,
Mark.
Mark, you don't mind?
Not at all.
Okay. Oh boy, I hope I didn't sound like too much of a Maoist. It was very unfortunate, my choice of words to say execute the asshole.
No, because it was clear. It was clear to me, at least, that you were giving the Maoist solution as the obvious, simple solution, but
Right.
not the one that you
Not the right one.
Not the one that you wanted.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem at all. I don't.
Well, that's part of what I wrestle with in working in my personal reading and stuff is that there's, how do you resolve this issue that humans are not kind, all of them, and they really don't care about it. Some of them don't really care about other people. They only care about themselves. So it's hard to resolve that in utopia. And writers have written about that forever.
Yeah. So my response to that is, I guess, this is a version of the answer that I gave. People are unkind, sure. So what's better? A world in which there are unkind people and also committees and police officers, or a world in which there are unkind people and those people do not have access to formal legal power? So Max Weber's whole definition of the state is ownership of violence in a given territory. There are people who are allowed to do violence, and when the violence is done, instead of saying, was that good or bad? Do we like that or not like it? We say, was it legal? Did it fit with the rules that were written down? And if it does fit with the rules that were written down, the violence is okay. Well, if you've got assholes, you don't want to live in a world where people can write down rules that make violence okay and do that violence. So assholes are much more dangerous with the power of the state and the law in their hands than they are without the state and the law. And then, of course, our answer of a good guy with a gun, right? That's what the police is. The good
Right.
guy who stops the bad guy. Well, I think that
Yeah.
that solution in the American left has gone out the window. Thank goodness.
Yeah, but don't you think that there's people who are prone to violence are going to be violent regardless of whether it's legal for them, if they feel like they won't, if there's no punitive action. So if someone's going to be violent and you give them a loaf of bread and they'll go, wow, that's a reward. You know, I'm still a violent jerk and I get fed every day. So then you have to become a punitive society. And then you're doing violence in return, or you're banishing people, or you're, you know, making them go on walkabouts or whatever, you know, whatever. And so how do you get around the cycle of violence? I mean, that's the part I wrestle with.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, I have answers for this question, but I don't want to pretend that I have like a stock answer that if someone implemented, the problem would be solved. My answers are guesses, are proposals, are thoughts. So again, I'm going to say the thing I guess I've been saying all along, which is, well, okay, the first thing is a society that accepts certain kinds of violence and deems that violence good is going to be worse off than a society that doesn't. And so the violent assholes have a tendency to get in situations, the military or the police, where they can not only be violent assholes, but then the quote law abiding members of the community support them in their violence. So one version of this is people will do violence no matter what, but it takes a legal state apparatus to have someone do violence with the full approval of almost every member of the community. And that's going to lead to more violence. The other thing is there are astonishing statistics of the amount of violence that goes on in prisons. And so when we put people in prisons, we definitely wildly escalate the amount of violence in society. And we just say that's okay. We don't actually say this, but we have accepted that that's okay because those are the people who did the violence. So they have in some ways given up their personhood. And then I guess this is a radical statement, but you just want to try and continue to believe in the personhood of people who are doing violence that suggests that they do not believe in your personhood. And there's a whole anarchist tradition, especially associated with Tolstoy and Gandhi, that says that.
Right.
And there's a whole other anarchist tradition that says, you're crazy. You know, we're not going to have prisons, but if they come at us with guns, we're going to shoot them. And Tolstoy and Gandhi say, then the battle is lost. Once you pick up a gun, the battle is lost. And I would rather die than kill.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, once you create that cycle of violence and impunity, the idea of punishment, yeah, it's hard. It's a hard question to resolve, and I don't know. From my experience with dystopian fiction.
Yes, that's what we're talking about.
It's not. I'm reading. Well, I'm listening, actually. I do a combination of reading and listening because I do so much time in the kitchen. I have to listen. Have you dabbled into Paradise yet?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's just out. And it's only I don't want to spoil it for you, but only the third book is really dystopian. But and it's hyperstate dystopia. It's, the state has taken over everything. And yeah, so I just don't feel like there's never, even when there's utopia, it's not utopia, it's never quite utopian. It's even the book Utopia is not utopian by any means, I think that
Oh no, yeah. the book Utopia is miserable. So I would, I call myself a utopian, but to me, utopia is not a place where everything is perfect and everything is happy. That's a silly definition of utopia.
Yeah, sure.
It's a place where, you're striving for that. Oscar Wilde says we arrive at utopia every day because every day we're making the world what we want it to be. And as soon as we land on the shores of utopia, we're unsatisfied and we see the next utopia down the way. Utopia be a process. And that's why these images of utopia are always terrifying, because they always suggest that the utopia has been achieved. So the first like counterintuitive thing is, if you want a utopia, you can't have a utopia. You can only have the true utopia is the striving towards utopia. And then the second thing is, the way you get that is try and carve away all the various things that restrict people from making the world a utopia. And when you do that, you will carve away not just the obvious things, prisons and military, but you'll get rid of schools also. I was a very successful student, but I would have learned so much more if instead of a school, I had had kind of a library. You know, if I'd had just a place where I could go and read and learn, and there would have been people to help me, but I didn't need teachers to tell me, you know, to learn. And then the argument is, oh, well, what about these people who don't want to learn? They all want to learn. They might want to learn to bake bread.
Well, I have two questions about, first of all, about the bread. How is you're using a local wheat? A lot of people, and us included, have trouble with local wheat because it doesn't hold a lot of it doesn't hold water. It's too non-glutinous. You know, because the hybrids, for better or for worse. So how is that working out for you?
I didn't want to get into this, but the answer is it works okay as a blend. Yeah. So I can blend it and get some nice results. The flavor is better. The crumb or whatever they say is not quite as good. But if I try and bake entirely with a local heirloom wheat, I mean, I can do some nice things with it, but not using the Bittman bread method.
Formula,
But my friend, he has a farm. He's got recipes, you know.
Well, yeah, and you can probably do more flatbreads and things like that. And
absolutely.
Not things that are not. But I think the more people come around to whole wheat baking, the more there'll be farmers that produce.
Yes.
You know, because there are varieties, and we have baked with them. Patwin is one of them. Red Fife can be pretty good. It depends on where it's grown. But that work well for open crumb and natural fermentation and stuff. And we even have the scientist at University of Oregon, Oregon State, who has been helping us, Andrew Ross. He's kind of like the world cereal expert. And we're so lucky to have gotten hooked up with him. But he really believes that the answer is not in wheat at all. It's in barley and other alternative grains. And so his lab is working on making, you know, lofty breads with those by fermenting those kind of flours. Both for nutrition, he believes both for nutrition and sustainability. Just wheat. There's other crops, obviously, that are easier to grow in rough climates and stuff than wheat.
The thing I would say, the only thing I would say, like in terms of, we didn't talk about bread much, and again, it was such a strange thing. That was such a fun conversation for me, but it was also completely, again, in my wheelhouse. I guess that was, you know, I was kind of joking with Mark, but usually when I bring someone into the show, I don't want to be, I mean, I think that's what Mark was referring to when he said, like, oh, this is your podcast. I don't try to be the expert on my show. But then when Mark is asking, like, so what would anarchism look like? What are the theories? Well, that's the thing that I spent a couple of years studying. So then I became the expert. So that was fun, but not bread focused. We didn't talk about yeast. We didn't talk about yeast, or rather sourdough, because I would call it yeast. I mean, I know Mark.
Well, it's natural. You're capturing natural. But we start with, of course, our process starts with commercial yeast because it's just so much easier. But then, and again, Dr. Ross assured us that not after very long, you cultivate. You know, that process cultivates your own culture, and because we keep it in the fridge, he was kind of amazed how high the pH is and how low the acidity is of our starter and our bread. And he determined, and he recommended to us that that's probably because it lives in the fridge and it cultivates yeast, a yeast culture that can tolerate 40-degree temperatures, and those kind of yeast respire more slowly, and they don't produce the acid that you get when you have it room temperature or higher fermentation process. So that's what he believes why our pH is so high.
That makes complete sense. So Kropotkin's most famous book is Conquest of Bread. His second most famous book is Mutual Aid, a Factor in Evolution. And he argues that anarchism is simply evolution, that anarchism is the dominant mode in the creation of organisms. And, you know, the only problem with humanity is in the late 19th century that, in part because of Darwin and Darwin's emphasis on competition, humanity has decided that the way to succeed is to eliminate as much cooperation as possible and replace it with competition. And Kropotkin says competition exists in nature, sure, but it's mostly cooperation. So if we want a society to mimic evolution, it should be mostly cooperative. And this weird thing called anarchism is in fact the thing that has created biological life, which turns it around and say, well, yeah, of course, you found a process that you liked in terms of making the bread, and who's doing most of the work? Well, the natural world is doing most of the work, and the natural world is anarchism, and it is the source of life, and the yeast are doing what they need to do for themselves and also what you need them to do. And Kropotkin would not be surprised by that at
that
all.
Is interesting.
Not in the slightest.
Oh, I'm going to have to do some reading of his. I mostly read fiction these days, but yeah. I'm going to I wrote them down. I'm definitely going to look them up.
I mean, I can email you certainly.
Okay. Great. I'm going to have to go soon too. We're working on more books.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, my kids are going to be here any second.
The book we're working on next is a kid's book, actually. How to cook everything for kids.
Fantastic.
With kids. Well, how to cook everything for kids.
Okay, yeah. I look forward to it. I don't know when it's coming out. I would love to have you on the show to talk about it.
It'll be
18 months or whenever it's coming out.
It'll be next fall, probably.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, it's a date then. If you don't hate being on the show. So
do your kids bake with you?
So
they're little.
They're 6 and 3, and the 6-year-old is trying, but she's just not there yet.
Yeah.
Oh man, so much fun. I probably say that after all of the interviews, but it always is just such a pleasure talking with Mark and Kerri, and then Kerri again. I mean, I feel like we have so much more to talk about in terms of bread and anarchism, and I hope to have them back on the show in the future to continue doing that. That's all for me, except I have to remind you that I do need your support. You can go to everydayanarchism.com to make a financial contribution to the show, or just tell a friend or leave a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. But especially if you can give, I know it always sounds so cheesy and tedious. Oh, for that $5 you spent on a cappuccino, if you gave that to me once a month, it would make a huge difference. But it would make a huge difference. People are giving financially, people are leaving reviews and ratings, but there's not that many people doing those things, and that leaves the show in a precarious position. So if you want to make sure the show stays around, then yeah, it's cliche. One day a month, skip a cappuccino or whatever your $5 pleasure is, and show some mutual aid for everyday anarchism. If you can, it would just mean so much. All that's left to say is that the music which you're about to hear is by David Hill.